Welcome to Smalltalk Daily for Tuesday, December 22nd, 2009. This morning I'd like to pick up with exception handling and go through a few more examples to demonstrate a few things that you can do. First, we'll take a very simple example. We'll take a divide by zero. Obviously you wouldn't put this in code, but it could come in from user input. And what I want to do here is say, if you try to divide by zero, just return with zero. So let's try this and see what happens. So we're going to do the execution on the divide by zero. And you notice instead of the exception we get zero because on the exception we do this return with. It turns out that anytime you handle an exception, you can return with any value you want. If you do a return on an exception, you'll get a nil back. If you do a return with, you can hand back anything you like, which for many cases is very useful because you can then hand back a default value for cases where you get nonsense from user input or from when the system gives you back something you didn't expect. Now here's a very simple exception that you can get also. This is a change in recent versions of VisualWorks as well. Strings are now immutable, so if I try this, I create a string and then at the third position I put a new character, I'm going to get a no modification error because strings are immutable. Now let's say that you had old code that needs to handle this. Turns out there's a compatibility package you can load in to always turn strings mutable when this happens. Probably not that great an idea to load because it's fraught with errors, but let's try seeing what you can do if you really need to do this kind of thing. And generally I'm not trying to show how to get around mutability so much as show another feature of exceptions. That's the retry. So here I do a string at 3 put the character F. If that fails on specifically a no modification error, make the string mutable and then retry the operation. So it's going to take whatever you tried to do the first time, make this change, whatever you have in this block down here, and retry it. Notice what comes into the block is the exception, so you can do further testing on the exception. You could catch a very generic exception up here and then in there look at the specifics. So here let's try that and see what happens. And now you see it went ahead and made the string mutable and put an F in the third position. Now, the case where you might want to test the internal exception, let's scroll down a bit. Here we have a query using HTTP, and I'm going to just get the contents of our website. And I'm scanning for a whole bunch of exceptions, but this one, HTTP exception, is kind of a catch-all. There are any number of HTTP exceptions that could happen. In this case, I'm just saying if you don't get anything back, return with nil. I could just say return, it would work just as well. But let's say that there are cases you might want to catch, like you might want to go into HTTP exception and say, well, what specific kind it is. You could catch all of them with this and then examine them in detail inside your error block if that's what you wanted. But here I'm just going to do this and do an inspect on the content. And apparently I can't type here because I've got a missing string quote, so let's try that again. Do an inspect. And sure enough, I've gotten content because querying the site gives me data back. So I've got my content, but had it not worked for whatever reason, if any of these exceptions had fired, I would have gotten a nil. It might actually happen if you're doing stress testing on a website. If you're trying to write a little framework in Smalltalk, for instance, to stress test a website, you might want to catch a bunch of errors because as you hammer a site, you might get some. All right, one more thing. Notice I'm catching a bunch of exceptions with this comma notation, exception, comma. This gives me back a collection of exceptions to handle, and in fact what it gives me is something called an exception set. So I look at that. If I needed to create this because I'm going to use the same one over and over again in various pieces in code, I might want to create it ahead of time. So exception set new, and then just add. So it works just like any other collection that way. And if I do this, you can see I'm going to get back the same thing that the comma notation did. So it's kind of, this is a shorthand if you only need it once. If you needed a number of places and you might want to cache it in an instance variable, that kind of thing, you'd probably create an exception set. Now, finally, one thing I want to go through to show you where this all comes from, all of these messages here like return with and retry up here, and there are a couple of others like proceed where you can just continue as if the thing hadn't happened. Let's go find class generic exception, and this is the abstract superclass for all exceptions. If you go in here to actions, you'll find all of the things that you can do. You can just exit the exception, you can pass it along, so see if there's another receiver further up the chain that's handling it. You can resignal it as a different exception, so you can say, well, I got this exception, I really want to get this one instead. I can resume it, I can retry it, which I showed you. You can return with some value, nil by default. So there are a number of things you can do with exception handling, and it's probably worth your while to go in and find class generic exception and look at the actions protocol and read the class comment. So that's about it for today. Until next time, have fun with Smalltalk.